In 1942, one man built a cargo ship in just 4 days and 15 hours, and nobody believed it was even possible until he did it right in front of their eyes. And that single achievement changed the entire course of World War II, because suddenly the Allies could replace ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Henry Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He wasn't an engineer by training, and he had never worked in a shipyard before the war started, but what he did have was something far more dangerous to the enemy. He had an idea that everyone said was crazy, and that idea was this. What if you could build a ship the same way Henry Ford built cars on an assembly line with interchangeable parts made in factories far from the ocean, then bolted together like a giant toy, and launched into the water before the welding torches even cooled down? The maritime industry laughed at him. The traditional shipbuilders called him an amateur. The naval architects said his methods would never work, that ships built so quickly would break apart in rough seas, that corners were being cut, that disaster was inevitable. But Kaiser didn't care what they thought, because while they were busy protecting their reputations, he was busy saving the war. Before Kaiser showed up, shipbuilding was an ancient craft passed down through generations where every vessel was practically custom-made by skilled workers who spent months or even years carefully constructing each ship from the keel up in massive dry docks that tied up valuable space and resources for enormous stretches of time. And this traditional method worked fine in peacetime when there was no rush, and quality could be painstakingly ensured through slow, careful work by experienced craftsmen who knew every rivet and weld by heart. But this was not peacetime. This was total war, and Britain was dying. German submarines were prowling the Atlantic in wolf packs, hunting Allied merchant ships like predators, stalking wounded prey, and they were winning the battle. They were sinking cargo vessels faster than Britain and America could replace them, and every ship that went down took with it food, fuel weapons, ammunition, tanks, planes, and all the other supplies that Britain desperately needed to survive the Nazi onslaught. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If more ships were being destroyed than built, Britain would eventually starve and surrender, and Hitler would control all of Europe, and the war would be lost before American soldiers even had a chance to fight. Churchill himself said the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril, because he understood that Britain was an island that imported most of its food and fuel, and without merchant ships bringing supplies across the Atlantic, the country would collapse within months, no matter how brave its soldiers or how determined its people. Into this desperate situation walked Henry J. Kaiser, a stocky man with round glasses and boundless energy who had made his fortune building roads, dams, and bridges across the American West, including the Hoover Dam, which was at the time the largest construction project in human history. Kaiser knew concrete and steel. He knew how to manage huge teams of workers. He knew how to solve problems that experts said were impossible. And most importantly, he knew how to move fast, because in construction delays cost money. And Kaiser hated wasting money almost as much as he hated being told something couldn't be done. When the government came looking for anyone who could build cargo ships faster, Kaiser raised his hand even though he had zero experience in shipbuilding, and everyone in the industry immediately dismissed him as a joke. They pointed out that building a ship is nothing like building a dam, that water is unforgiving, that the ocean will find every weakness, every shortcut, every mistake. and that men would die if Kaiser's amateur hour experiments failed in the middle of the Atlantic during a winter storm with waves the size of buildings and winds that could peel steel like tinfoil. Kaiser listened to all their objections, nodded politely, and then completely ignored them because he saw something they didn't see. He saw that shipbuilding in 1940 was still being done almost exactly the same way it had been done for hundreds of years, and that meant there was room for massive improvement if someone was willing to challenge every assumption and throw out the old rule book entirely. The traditional approach was to build each ship in place, starting with the keel, and slowly adding ribs and plates and decks and superstructure piece by piece, with workers clambering all over the growing vessel like ants on a hill. Each craftsman doing his specialized job in sequence, waiting for the previous crew to finish before starting his own task. And this method required huge amounts of skilled labor and time and space, because you couldn't start the next ship until the current one was finished and launched. Kaiser looked at this process and thought it was completely insane, because it violated every principle of modern industrial production that had been proven in factories across America for decades. Why build one ship at a time when you could build multiple ships simultaneously? Why construct everything on site when you could fabricate components in factories where conditions were controlled and workers could specialize? Why use skilled craftsmen for every single task when you could break the work down into simple, repetitive steps that less experienced workers could learn quickly? So Kaiser proposed something radical. He would use prefabrication and modular construction techniques borrowed from the automotive and construction industries to mass-produce cargo ships at a speed that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. His idea was to break the ship down into massive prefabricated sections that could be built separately in huge factories and warehouses far from the actual shipyard, then transported to the dock and welded together like building blocks in a matter of days rather than months. The bow section would be built in one location, the stern in another. The deck sections, the engine room, the crew quarters, all fabricated separately by different teams working simultaneously, then brought together and assembled on the slipway in a carefully choreographed sequence that Kaiser planned out with the precision of a military invasion. This approach meant that instead of waiting for one part of the ship to be completed before starting the next multiple sections, could be under construction at the same time, with hundreds or even thousands of workers contributing to a single vessel without getting in each other's way, and the moment one ship was launched, the next set of prefabricated sections would be ready to assemble, meaning the slipways would never sit empty and production could continue around the clock 7 days a week. The ships Kaiser proposed to build were called Liberty ships, and they were based on a British design for a simple, rugged cargo vessel that could carry 10,000 tons of supplies across the ocean and hopefully survive the journey, even if it wasn't fast or pretty or comfortable. These were not warships, they were not sleek or heavily armed. They were essentially floating boxes designed to haul as much cargo as possible, as cheaply and quickly as possible, and then hopefully make it back for another trip. The design was deliberately basic, with a simple steam engine that was outdated even by 1940 standards, but was chosen because it was reliable and easy to manufacture and didn't require exotic materials or highly skilled mechanics to maintain. Everything about the Liberty ship was optimized for mass production rather than performance. They all looked identical. They used standard components, they had minimal amenities for the crew, and they were built with an acceptance that some would be lost to enemy action or rough seas, but that didn't matter because they could be replaced so quickly that the Germans would never be able to sink them fast enough to make a difference. Kaiser set up shipyards on the West Coast, in places like Richmond, California, where land was cheap and available, and where he could recruit workers from all over the country, including many women who had never done industrial work before, but who learned quickly and worked just as effectively as the men they replaced. He built enormous fabrication sheds where sections of the ship could be assembled under cover, protected from weather, and where specialized teams could focus on repetitive tasks, becoming incredibly efficient through practice. One team would do nothing but weld deck plates. Another would install piping. Another would work on electrical systems, and each team would complete their section, then move on to the next ship, while their work was transported to the slipway for final assembly. Kaiser also invested heavily in training programs to turn inexperienced workers into competent welders and fitters in a matter of weeks, rather than the years of apprenticeship that traditional shipyards required, and he paid good wages and provided childcare and health care and all the support services that workers needed to stay productive and loyal. But having a good plan and enthusiastic workers wasn't enough. Kaiser also needed to solve enormous technical and logistical challenges that would have stopped a less determined person in their tracks. Welding was a particular problem because traditional shipbuilding used rivets to join metal plates together, which was slow but reliable, while welding was much faster, but also much more prone to failure if not done correctly. And there was a real fear that welded ships might literally split in half in cold water or rough seas. Kaiser's team had to develop new welding techniques and procedures and quality control systems to ensure that every weld was strong enough to hold the ship together under the most extreme conditions, and this required constant testing and adjustment and a willingness to learn from mistakes, even when those mistakes were catastrophic. Several early Liberty ships did, in fact, break apart, some of them, splitting completely in two and sinking with all hands, and each disaster was investigated thoroughly to identify the cause and implement fixes, and gradually the welding procedures improved and the failure rate dropped. And the ships became more reliable, even though they would never be as strong as traditionally riveted vessels. Logistics were another nightmare because building ships from prefabricated sections meant coordinating the delivery of hundreds of enormous steel components from factories and suppliers spread across the entire country, and if any one piece was delayed or built incorrectly, it could halt production on an entire vessel. Kaiser created detailed schedules and tracking systems to monitor every component and anticipate problems before they caused delays, and he maintained buffer stocks of critical parts so that minor issues wouldn't cascade into major shutdowns. He also pushed his suppliers relentlessly to increase their own production and meet his demanding deadlines, and he wasn't afraid to switch suppliers or bring production in-house if someone couldn't keep up with the pace he demanded. This aggressive management style made Kaiser some enemies in the business community, but it also made him incredibly effective because while other people were making excuses, Kaiser was making ships. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched in September 1941, just before America officially entered the war, and it took about 230 days to build, which was actually pretty good by the standards of the time, but nowhere near fast enough to meet the desperate need for cargo capacity. But Kaiser wasn't satisfied. He knew that every day shaved off the construction. Time meant more ships in the water, sooner and more supplies reaching Britain, and more pressure on the Germans, and less chance that the Allies would lose the Battle of the Atlantic before they even had a chance to fight back on land. So his teams kept refining the process, identifying bottlenecks, streamlining workflows, improving tools and techniques, and gradually the construction time started to drop 200 days, then 150, then 100, then 80, and the rate kept falling as workers became more experienced, and as the prefabrication system was perfected, and as Kaiser pushed harder and harder for speed without sacrificing too much quality. By 1942, Kaiser's yards were launching a new Liberty ship every month, then every 2 weeks, then every week, and the output was staggering and started to genuinely worry the German High Command because their U-boat captains were reporting that no matter how many ships they sank, there always seemed to be more convoys, more targets, more Allied vessels than there had been the month before. The mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic were starting to shift in favor of the Allies, not because the U-boats were being defeated, they were actually sinking ships at a higher rate than ever, but because Kaiser and the other American shipbuilders were replacing losses faster than the Germans could inflict them, and this meant that the total tonnage of Allied shipping was actually increasing despite the constant attacks. For the first time since the war began, the Allies were winning the production race, and that terrified the Germans because they knew that if they couldn't starve Britain into submission quickly, then America's industrial might would eventually overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers. But Kaiser still wasn't satisfied with building one ship per week. He wanted to prove that his system could go even faster, that the theoretical limits of prefabrication and modular construction hadn't been reached yet, and that with perfect coordination and maximum effort, something truly extraordinary was possible. So, in November 1942, he announced that his Richmond shipyard would attempt to build a complete Liberty ship from keel laying to launch in less than 5 days, and the announcement was met with widespread skepticism and mockery from traditional shipbuilders who said it was a publicity stunt, that the ship would be incomplete or unsafe or both, and that Kaiser was being reckless with the lives of merchant seamen who would have to crew these vessels in dangerous waters. Kaiser ignored the critics as usual and organized the attempt like a military operation, with every worker briefed on their role with backup teams standing by in case of problems with materials pre-positioned, and quality inspectors watching every step to ensure that speed didn't compromise safety. The ship they would build was the SS Robert E. Peary, and construction began on November 3rd, with hundreds of workers swarming over the slipway, working in shifts around the clock under bright floodlights that turned night into day. Prefabricated sections arrived from the assembly sheds in a continuous stream, like some kind of industrial ballet, with cranes lifting massive hull sections and deck plates and superstructure components into position, where welding teams immediately began joining them together in showers of sparks that lit up the night. The noise was incredible. The smell of hot metal and diesel fuel and welding flux hung in the air like a physical presence, and the sense of urgency was palpable, as everyone involved understood that they were attempting something that had never been done before and that the eyes of the world were watching. Supervisors prowled the site with stopwatches and clipboards, coordinating the work and solving problems as they arose, and pushing everyone to move faster, but not so fast that mistakes would happen, because a mistake now could delay the whole project, or worse, could result in a ship that would break apart at sea and kill everyone aboard. The pace was relentless. Sections that normally took days to install were being positioned and welded in hours through sheer force of coordinated effort, and the ship began to take shape with astonishing speed, growing from a bare keel into a recognizable vessel almost as you watched. Workers who had been skeptical at first found themselves caught up in the excitement and pushed themselves harder than they thought possible, fueled by adrenaline and pride and the knowledge that they were part of something historic. By the end of the first day, the keel and bottom plates were in place. By the second day, the hull was taking shape. By the third day, the deck was being installed and the superstructure was going up, and by the fourth day, it actually looked like a ship rather than a construction site. Quality inspectors checked welds and fittings as fast as they were completed, signing off on work that met standards and flagging problems that needed immediate correction. And remarkably, the error rate was no higher than on ships built at a normal pace, because the workers understood the stakes and were being extra careful despite the speed. On November 7th, just 4 days and 15.5 hours after construction began, the SS Robert E. Peary rolled down the slipway into the water to the cheers of thousands of workers and spectators who had gathered to witness the event. The ship was complete, fully functional, ready to load cargo and sail across the ocean, and it had been built in less time than some people take to remodel a kitchen. The achievement made headlines around the world and became a symbol of American industrial might, and determination a middle finger to Hitler and his U-boats, and proof that democracy and capitalism could outproduce fascism, and that the outcome of the war might ultimately be decided not on battlefields but in factories and shipyards by workers in hard hats rather than soldiers in helmets. The Robert E. Peary's record-breaking construction time was never officially beaten. It remained the fastest build of a Liberty ship throughout the war, and stands to this day as one of the most impressive achievements in industrial history. But the really important thing wasn't the record itself, it was what the record represented, which was that Kaiser had completely revolutionized shipbuilding and proven that modern mass production techniques could be applied to even the most complex and traditional industries if someone was willing to challenge the conventional wisdom and take risks. The average construction time for Liberty ships continued to drop, reaching a low of about 42 days by the middle of the war, which meant that Kaiser's yards alone were producing multiple, complete, ocean-going cargo vessels every single week, and when you added in all the other shipyards that had adopted his methods, the total output was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built over 2,700 Liberty ships, plus thousands of other vessels, including tankers, troop transports, warships, and landing craft, and this incredible surge in maritime production completely changed the strategic situation in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The Liberty ships themselves had mixed reputations among the sailors who crewed them. Some men loved them for their simplicity and ruggedness, while others complained that they were cold, uncomfortable, and prone to problems, especially in heavy weather. The ships were often called ugly ducklings or Kaiser's coffins by critics who pointed out their design limitations and the occasional structural failures that occurred when poorly welded ships encountered severe conditions. Several Liberty ships did break apart, including the SS John P. Gaines, which split in half in the Pacific in 1943, fortunately near land, so the crew was rescued, and these incidents led to investigations and design improvements, including the addition of crack arresters and stronger steel in critical areas. But despite their flaws and occasional failures, the Liberty ships did their job. They carried millions of tons of cargo across dangerous waters. They kept Britain fed and supplied. They supported the D-Day invasion and the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, and they helped win the war through sheer numbers and persistence. Many Liberty ships survived the war and continued working for decades afterward, some lasting into the 1970s, hauling cargo around the world long after people had forgotten the desperate circumstances that led to their creation. Kaiser himself became a celebrity during the war. His face appeared on magazine covers. He was praised by Roosevelt and Churchill, and he was held up as an example of American ingenuity and can-do spirit. He used his fame and influence to push for other innovations, including early health maintenance organizations that provided affordable health care to workers and their families decades before such systems became common. After the war, Kaiser branched out into other industries, including automobiles, where he produced the Kaiser and Fraser car brands that enjoyed brief success before being overwhelmed by the big Detroit automakers and aluminum production and steel and construction, and he remained active and influential until his death in 1967. But his lasting legacy was proving that supposedly impossible things could be done if you were willing to ignore the experts and try anyway, and that sometimes the best solution to a problem is the one that everyone says won't work. The impact of Kaiser's shipbuilding revolution extended far beyond just winning World War II, because the techniques he pioneered, prefabrication, modular construction, mass production of complex products using semi-skilled labor, became standard practice in many industries after the war. Modern shipbuilding still uses many of the methods Kaiser developed, and the same principles have been applied to everything from aircraft to buildings to bridges to offshore oil platforms. The idea that you can build something faster by breaking it into modules and assembling them quickly rather than crafting everything on site from scratch is now so obvious that people forget it was once considered radical and impossible. Kaiser proved that time itself could be treated as a resource to be optimized and minimized, and that speed of production could be just as important as quality or cost, especially in situations where time is critical. There's also a broader lesson here about how wars drive innovation, not just in weapons and tactics, but in logistics and production and organization. World War II forced countries to rethink every aspect of how they made things and moved things and managed people, and many of the systems and techniques that came out of that forced innovation ended up transforming civilian life in peacetime. The interstate highway system in America was partly inspired by the German Autobahn and the need to move military equipment quickly across the country. The commercial aviation industry was built on technology developed for military aircraft. The computer revolution grew out of code breaking and ballistics calculations, and Kaiser's shipbuilding methods influenced everything from construction to manufacturing. Wars are terrible and destructive, but they also create pressure that breaks old ways of doing things and forces rapid adaptation, and some of that adaptation turns out to be useful long after the fighting stops. Kaiser's story is also a reminder that expertise and experience aren't always advantages and can sometimes be obstacles to progress. The traditional shipbuilders knew everything about building ships. They understood the craft intimately. They had decades of accumulated wisdom and experience, but that same knowledge made them conservative and resistant to change because they could see all the ways that new methods might fail, and they were invested in the old ways that had worked for them throughout their careers. Kaiser had none of that baggage. He didn't know what was impossible, so he tried it anyway, and discovered that many of the supposed barriers were really just assumptions that had never been properly challenged. This pattern shows up again and again in history, where outsiders disrupt established industries precisely because they don't know the rules and therefore don't feel bound by them. And while this sometimes leads to disaster, it also occasionally leads to breakthroughs that transform entire fields. Of course, we should be careful not to romanticize Kaiser too much, because while his achievements were real and important, he was also a ruthless businessman who pushed workers hard and didn't always prioritize their safety and comfort over production targets. The accident rate in Kaiser's shipyards was significant. Workers died from falls and equipment accidents and other hazards of working in heavy industry under constant pressure to move faster and do more. Kaiser paid well and provided benefits, but he also demanded extraordinary effort, and not everyone thrived under that kind of intense pressure. The ships themselves, as mentioned before, had quality issues that sometimes killed the men who sailed on them. And while Kaiser's teams worked to fix problems as they were discovered, the decision to prioritize speed inevitably meant accepting more risk than a more cautious approach would have tolerated. War forced these trade-offs. Britain needed ships immediately, not eventually, and slower construction would have meant fewer ships and more sailors dying from U-boat attacks and possibly losing the entire war, so the decision to accept some additional risk in ship construction was probably justified, but that doesn't mean it was cost-free. Another interesting aspect of the Liberty Ship program is how it demonstrated the power of government-industry cooperation during wartime. Kaiser couldn't have built his shipyards without massive government funding and contracts. The capital required was far beyond what any private company could have raised on its own, and the risk was too high for private investors who had no guarantee that the war would last long enough for the investment to pay off. So the government essentially underwrote the entire program, providing the money and the orders and the raw materials and accepting the risk, while Kaiser provided the management and innovation and drive. This kind of partnership was common during World War II, and it worked remarkably well because both sides had clear incentives the government needed ships desperately, and Kaiser wanted to make money and build his reputation, and those aligned interests meant they could work together effectively without the usual bureaucratic friction and corporate short-term thinking that often plague large projects. The success of the Liberty Ship program also highlighted America's enormous industrial capacity, which was probably the single most important factor in the Allied victory in World War II. Germany and Japan were formidable military powers with experienced armies and navies and air forces, but they simply couldn't match American production once the country fully mobilized. American factories produced more tanks, more planes, more ships, more guns, more ammunition, more of everything than the Axis powers could possibly match. And this material superiority eventually overwhelmed German and Japanese forces, no matter how skilled or brave or determined they were. A single American shipyard could produce more cargo vessels in a year than the entire German or Japanese shipbuilding industry combined, and when you multiply that across dozens of shipyards and hundreds of aircraft factories and thousands of other industrial facilities, the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. The Axis powers knew this, which is why their strategy relied on quick victories before American production could ramp up. But once they failed to win quickly and the American industrial machine got rolling, their defeat became inevitable even if it took several more years of brutal fighting to make it final. Kaiser's achievement also demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare, which is less glamorous than tales of heroic battles, but arguably more important to actual victory. Armies need food and fuel and ammunition and spare parts and medical supplies and clothing and all the other mundane stuff that keeps soldiers alive and fighting, and all of that has to be transported from factories to ports, to ships, to more ports, to trains and trucks, and finally to the front lines. And if any link in that chain breaks, the whole system fails. The Liberty ships were that crucial link across the most dangerous part of the supply chain, the Atlantic Ocean, and by making sure that link never broke, Kaiser and his workers enabled everything else, the invasions, the battles, the eventual victory. Generals get the glory, but wars are won by the unglamorous people who make sure the supplies arrive on time. It's also worth noting that the Liberty Ship program created opportunities for people who had previously been excluded from industrial work, particularly women and minorities, who took jobs in Kaiser's shipyards because so many men had gone off to fight. The famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaigns encouraged women to take factory jobs, and many did learning skills and earning wages that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And while most women were pushed out of these jobs after the war ended when the men came home, the experience of having worked and earned their own money and proven they could do supposedly male jobs had a lasting impact on American society and helped set the stage for later feminist movements. Similarly, black workers found opportunities in Kaiser's yards that were rare in the deeply segregated America of the 1940s, and while discrimination and segregation remained serious problems, the war did create some cracks in the old system that would eventually widen into the civil rights movement of the following decades. Looking back from our current perspective, it's remarkable how quickly Kaiser transformed an entire industry and how completely his methods displaced the old ways of building ships. Before the war, most people would have said that traditional shipbuilding was already highly optimized after centuries of refinement and that there wasn't much room for improvement. But Kaiser proved that sometimes even very old industries can be revolutionized if someone is willing to question every assumption and try radically different approaches. The speed of the transformation was also striking, going from 230 days to build a ship to just over 4 days in barely a year is an incredible improvement curve, and it happened because the war created urgency that overrode all the normal resistance to change. In peacetime, Kaiser probably couldn't have gotten funding for his experiments, and the traditional shipbuilders would have lobbied to block him. And even if he'd succeeded, the adoption of his methods would have taken decades as the old guard slowly retired and the new generation took over. But war compressed that timeline into months because there was no time for gradual change. It was adapt or die. The story of Kaiser and the Liberty ships is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and determination in the face of crisis. When Britain was starving and U-boats were winning and everything looked hopeless, someone had the audacity to say, "There's a better way, and we can do the impossible if we're willing to try," and then actually went out and did it. That kind of bold thinking and willingness to take risks and refusal to accept limitations is rare and valuable, and it shows up throughout history in different forms. The entrepreneurs who build new industries, the scientists who make breakthrough discoveries, the activists who change societies, the leaders who see possibilities that others miss. Kaiser wasn't a perfect person, and his methods weren't perfect, and the ships he built weren't perfect, but he changed the course of history by refusing to accept that things had to be done the way they'd always been done. And that's a lesson that remains relevant today when we face new challenges that seem impossible until someone figures out how to do them anyway. The mathematical reality of what Kaiser achieved is staggering when you actually calculate it out. If a Liberty ship took 230 days to build using traditional methods, and Kaiser got that down to an average of 42 days. That means his yards were building ships more than 5 times faster than the old system. And if you factor in that he was also building more ships simultaneously by using modular construction, the total throughput was probably 10 to 15 times higher than traditional yards could achieve with the same resources. That kind of productivity improvement in a single year would be considered extraordinary in any industry, and in shipbuilding, which was ancient and conservative, it was nothing short of revolutionary. The economic value of this improvement was enormous as well because every ship that entered service earlier meant more cargo delivered sooner, which meant more weapons and supplies for the front lines, which meant battles won that might otherwise have been lost, which ultimately meant lives saved and the war shortened. It's impossible to say exactly how many lives Kaiser's innovations saved, but it's certainly in the tens of thousands at minimum, and possibly much more. Every convoy that made it across the Atlantic because there were enough escort vessels, every invasion that succeeded because supplies arrived on time, every battle where Allied forces had adequate ammunition and food because the supply chain worked, all of those positive outcomes flowed at least partly from the fact that Kaiser had figured out how to build ships faster than anyone thought possible. The sailors who served on Liberty ships probably didn't think much about the man who'd designed the system that built their vessels. They were too busy worrying about U-boats and storms and the 1,000 other dangers of wartime merchant service. But they owed their chances of survival to Kaiser's genius, because without his ships there wouldn't have been enough merchant vessels to spread the German attacks across, and the loss rate would have been even higher than it was. Today, a handful of Liberty ships still exist as museum ships and memorials to the massive effort that produced them and to the sailors who served on them during the war. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien is moored in San Francisco, and the SS John W. Brown is in Baltimore, and both are maintained in working condition and occasionally take short cruises to demonstrate that these 70-plus-year-old vessels are still seaworthy, despite all the predictions that they'd fall apart. These surviving ships are physical reminders of what can be accomplished when necessity drives innovation and when people are willing to work together toward a common goal. And when someone like Kaiser comes along who has the vision to see possibilities that others miss, and the determination to make those possibilities real, despite all the obstacles and skeptics and experts who say it can't be done. So the next time you hear someone say, "That's impossible," or "We've always done it this way," or "It can't be done any faster," remember Henry Kaiser and his Liberty ships and how he proved that sometimes the impossible is just something nobody's tried yet, and how 4 days and 15 hours was long enough to build a ship that could cross an ocean and help win a war. And maybe think about what supposedly impossible things in your own life or field might actually be possible if someone was willing to challenge the assumptions and try something different and push harder than anyone thinks is reasonable, because history suggests that the people who change the world are usually the ones who didn't know they were supposed to give up. Click that subscribe button if you want more stories about people who did impossible things when it mattered most.